Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I am back today with another story for you. If you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. Today we are going to talk about the lost cabin mine of Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains. So there's a big treasure story and legend that has lived on for a century and a half in Wyoming about a lost cabin at a very good gold producing mine or vein. And I had a suggestion to do this story from one of my subscribers, Michael W. And I love getting suggestions from my subscribers because it's impossible to know about all the different stories out there. And there are some really good treasure stories out there that really need to be told again so people can relive them and think about them and everything. So, this lost cabin story in Wyoming is definitely one of them. There's a lot of details, a lot of intrigue when it comes to this story, a lot of different nuances and versions of this story told, and people that have claimed to have found it and lost it again, like a lot of these kind of stories. So, now with this story, as with most treasure stories, there's a debate on which creek this gold find lies on or where it is located. It could be Badwater Creek, or it could be one of the three branches of Crazy Woman Creek. It seems to vary according to the story that you listen to as to the general vicinity of this area. Either way, it seems to be located in the Bighorn Mountains of north central Wyoming. So, one of the stories that I'm going to tell you about has been written about by Hans Longren, and he has a story where he tells some of the details, and there's some other stories we'll go over too, which are most likely the same cabin, potentially people that maybe found it after the original people and then lost it again. So we'll go over a few of those details. But his story that he has told, that's very well written. He starts off in October 1865. Two men entered the gate at Fort Reno, Wyoming Territory. They were totally exhausted. The only thing they carried with them was a leather bag filled with gold estimated to be worth about $7,000 at the time, a tremendous amount of money. Both of the men were of Swedish origin. One of them seemed confused and showed signs of being mentally ill. The commanding officer of Fort Reno believed that the men were Army deserters and put them in jail. And then they were taken to Fort Fetterman to be sentenced. It was there that they were found to be innocent civilians. They were released and went on to Fort Laramie, where their gold was stored in the Post Bank and Trade Office. This is the start of the legendary and true story of the lost cabin mine. What is truth and what is legend has so far not been carefully examined, and in the following, what has been found, documented, and proven to have happened will be described. But first, the rest of the story as it has been told by many sources. Sometime in the late fall of 1865, a party of 7 Swedes left the Black Hills of Dakota Territory. They pushed west for some weeks and arrived at the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. They crossed the mountains and they came to a stream today known as Badwater Creek. One evening they camped. One of the men went to the creek to fetch water. As he knelt to fill his bucket, he saw glitter in the sand in the light of the moon. And he had heard of yellow mica, but he put his hand into the cold water and stretched for a handful of sand. And in the sand he saw and felt nuggets. "Gold! Gold!" he cried. "I've found gold!" His partners rushed to the creek. That night none of the men were able to sleep. They laughed, talked, and built dreams of wealth to come as the night became darker and deeper. The next day they found the gold vein. A part of the riverside had collapsed, and the sand was easy to pan and find the nuggets. The men knew that snow, ice, and cold winds could arrive any day. The nights were already cold, and the tops of the mountains were already covered by white caps of snow. They built a small cabin and worked tirelessly over the next days, while they talked about the best way to protect their secret. Some thought they should prepare for a long stay in the area and build a bigger cabin. Others suggested that they should work hard and leave the hostile country as soon as possible. The alternatives were discussed, and finally the decision was made to stay another 2 days. The decision determined their fates. The presence of a small group of miners had been observed by some Indians moving around the area. They were too few to attack the miners, but they went for reinforcements. One morning at dawn, the unsuspecting Swedes were attacked by the Indians. The 7 men had been so preoccupied by their search for gold that they had forgotten that they were in the area populated by hostile natives. 4 of the Swedes were killed immediately. 3 of them managed to escape but were discovered by the Indians the next morning. In a new fight, many of the Indians were killed, and one of the remaining Swedes was badly wounded. The men finally took shelter in a cave. The wounded man died, and the 2 remaining found themselves in a dry, unfriendly country without food or equipment and surrounded by enemies. The weather worsened, and their lives hung in the balance. The Indians took their horses and left them to die. The 2 survivors were many miles from a settlement where help and safety could be found. They had to start the long and difficult trek back to safety by walking during the night and hiding during the daytime. They hiked east over the mountains and reached the barren plains. After 2 weeks, exhausted and close to death, they entered the gates of Fort Reno on the banks of the Powder River. At first they were treated as army deserters and were arrested, but eventually their true identities were determined and they were released. The gold that they carried during their hardships was deposited at the bank office of Fort Laramie. Many people believe that the tale of the 2 Swedes told, and soon miners and other adventurers were gathering at Fort Laramie were waiting for the next spring to come. One of the Swedes returned to the Black Hills. In May of 1866, he organized a new party of 12 men and headed for the Bighorn area by the same route that the original party had taken. The group disappeared without a trace. Legend has it that the Indians of the area used to talk of a battle in which all the whites were killed. So this could have been that group. Now only one of the original 7 Swedes, a mentally deranged man, was left. He was living at Fort Laramie. His speech was incoherent and composed of strings of words with no meaning. Now and then a word of sense was heard, and many a man tried to get some information from the lone cabin mine out of the poor man. But the pieces of information received were too few to form a road or a site map. Some men believed that the story was false, but the gold stored at the bank was evidence enough for the majority to believe that the story was true. Eventually, a new party was organized. This was to be a huge expedition of 120 men under the leadership of famous Jim Bridger. They brought the Swede with them, hoping that he might give them some clues. Many members of the expedition were provoked by the poor fool and wanted to hang him, as he was unable to lead the party to the gold, but Jim Bridger prevented the lynching. Hostile Indians forced Bridger back to Fort Laramie, and without his command, the group was disbanded. For several years, the poor and confused Swede walked around the Bighorns and searching for the lost mine. As soon as someone said it was a fabrication, another pointed to the fact of a bag full of gold. The bag remained as a silent witness to the truth of the story. Another account of the story mentions that from 3 to 7 prospectors had ventured into the Bighorn Mountains in a quest for gold, and they had built a cabin to live in and a flume or a sluice box to work their discovery. And their discovery was said to be a rich gold placer, and they were said to amass a considerable amount of gold when they were suddenly attacked by Sioux or Cheyenne warriors who killed all but one survivor. In this account, the lone survivor made it out to a fort, which I believe would have been Fort Reno, where he told his story and showed the gold. And it does state in this account that that fort was named Fort Reno and was on the east flank of the Bighorn Range. So there's two versions of what happened next, according to this account. Either the survivor was getting sick and he died without giving a map or good directions to the mine, or he had assembled a group of partners to accompany him back to the mine, but on the trip they were all massacred by the Native Americans and there were no survivors. So this account goes on to say that the mine had been found and lost repeatedly, and in several cases the person who discovered the cabin and mine was unable to find it again, and the search area is huge. For the Bighorn Range runs a considerable distance, and Fort Reno, which no longer exists, but as the mine was said to be some 3 days' travel from the fort, it could be almost anywhere in the Bighorn Range. So key points were that it was on a running stream, that there was a cabin built, which was standing some years later, and that a flume or a sluice had been built there too. So there was another chapter of the story too that happens a little bit later. It comes in at 1873 or so, and there was an old Catholic missionary named Father Jean-Pierre de Smet, and he was waiting for a train in Cheyenne, and he was supposed to travel back to St. Louis to his home parish, but the old father was in failing health and perhaps knew that his death was coming, pretty soon, and he felt it necessary to make a confession to his friend, old Indian known as Running Deer. So de Smet told Running Deer of a journey he took in the late 1850s or so around the Bighorn Mountain Range in search of a summer hunting camp of a local Sioux tribe which he planned to preach to. So while stopping to water his horse in the valley along a tributary of the river there, he had noticed what appeared to be a small structure sitting a short distance away, nestled along the side of the hill. So upon entering the cabin, the father saw piles of gold lying on the cabin floor, along with a decaying corpse lying in the corner, and he said that he did a blessing over the deceased, and he quietly left the cabin and continued on his journey. So as a man of God, he explained, he passed on the prospect of wealth, opting to allow someone else to share in the discovery. He also feared that since the cabin was found by an agent of the church, that the church would claim the treasure for itself, and so he went on his way as he didn't really want any part of that. So upon hearing this story, Running Deer bid farewell to his friend and immediately headed northwards towards Buffalo, Wyoming, the nearest town to the location that de Smet had given him. And Running Deer had grown up in the region, and he knew the patterns of the rivers and their tributaries in the area, and there he formed a pretty good guess as to where the cabin was most likely located. So on arriving in Buffalo, Running Deer decided to enlist the help of a trusted friend who also happened to be a prospector, a man named Joe Svensson. known around town as Old Joe. Old Joe had heard the legends of the lost cabin and had spent a great deal of time searching for it himself, but before, conceding to failure, he just, was hanging around town and I guess figuring he probably wasn't going to find it. But anyhow, unfortunately for running deer, gold fever hit Old Joe and hit him pretty hard when running deer had disclosed the probable location of the mine to Old Joe. And the muzzle flash of Joe's .45 caliber Colt revolver was the last thing that running deer had seen after he told Old Joe all the details. But fate took a turn on Joe instantaneously thereafter, for it was said that Old Joe was found in the middle of the street on Main Street, I believe in Buffalo, in front of the Wyoming saloon, and he happened to try to cross the street without looking and was struck by the stagecoach coming from Deadwood, and the town doctor declared him dead on the scene. So he didn't even live long enough to try to go, to go out into the mountains and use these new details that running deer had told him. He may have talked about it in the saloon a bit, left the saloon, and got hit by the stagecoach. So those are a couple of other stories about the lost cabin. A couple of those have a little bit of mixed details. I'm not sure of the validity of those, but I believe the first story told is pretty much what people believe with the Swedes. So anyhow, you can let me know what you think about these stories in the comments.